I would like to open us with prayer before introducing Mary Kate. Let us pray. Almighty God, in giving us dominion over things on earth, you have made us fellow workers in your creation. Give us wisdom and reverence so to use the resources of nature that no one may suffer from our abuse of them, and that generations yet to come may continue to praise you for your bounty. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mary Kate Wool, the CEO and president of the Church Pension Fund for over 11 years. Mary Kate also serves as a member of the CPG board. Before joining CPG in 2011, Mary Kate had a career spanning service in the federal government, a top New York City law firm, and as an executive at Wyeth Pharmaceuticals. Mary Kate has also served on the vestry of 3 Episcopal churches and brings to CPG not only business acumen, but a deep love and devotion to our church. Mary Kate, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I'm so happy that you all have joined us today. This is the 4th in a series this year, and we've had at least for the previous many number of years, but of our Insights and Ideas events. And these started as panel discussions hosted around the country, where we'd travel to Houston or San Francisco or Minneapolis or wherever. And of course, with the pandemic, that came to a screeching halt, but we did not want the Insights and Ideas events to come to a screeching halt. So we started doing them virtually as we are now. And that enabled us to reach a much broader audience. So we're probably going to continue these virtually by and large, and are just so delighted that you've joined us today. The topic today is going to be one on collaboration with the church, how different church organizations promote church values and how we all work together to do that. And there are different organizations represented here today. One is CCSR, the Committee on Corporate Social Responsibility, which is a committee of executive council that's tasked with advancing shareholder engagement with companies that are in the Episcopal Church portfolio. And the second organization that is represented is the Office of Government Relations for the Episcopal Church, located in Washington, D.C. And that body represents the policy priorities of the Episcopal Church with the U.S. government, and I believe also state governments as well. And then CPG, we're not a policy organization, or we're very different from these other 2 organizations. Basically, our mission is to provide pensions and financial security to the clergy and lay employees of the Episcopal Church. Nevertheless, we oversee a large portfolio, and to the extent that we can legally and still carry out our fiduciary obligations, we also attempt to use that portfolio to advance the values of the Episcopal Church. And just a brief moment on that, we have a 4-pronged strategy for socially responsible investing that we think is very powerful and successful. The first prong of that strategy is what we call impact investing. And that is trying to find those investments that have a social or environmental good that also provide the returns that we legally have to require for the portfolio. The second part of the strategy, which we'll talk about a lot today, is shareholder engagement. And that is using the shareholder status with public companies in our portfolio to be able to have a voice with those companies and be able to articulate and persuade those companies to align with the values of the Episcopal Church. The third prong of our CPG strategy is what we call ESG incorporation. And that means taking environmental, social, and governance considerations into account as we look across our entire portfolio, do diligence on companies, engage with managers in our portfolio. And the last is what we refer to as thought leadership, which includes this event today. And thought leadership is really, from our perspective, sharing a lot of the intelligence that we come across as we do our investing, sharing the experts that we are so fortunate to rub arms with day after day as we go about our business, and also to serve as a catalyst for capital for really worthy investments. So if we find a particular impact investment where we may be an anchor investor, an original investor, we will go out to our faith-based colleagues or peers across the universe and encourage them also to jump in and share ownership of those investments with us. Sometimes, and focusing on shareholder engagement, sometimes influencing an individual company is the most important priority. Other times, the issue is much, much bigger and requires a policy response. And that's where we get to the Office of Government Relations in Washington, where it's beyond just engaging with a single company or industry. It's a much bigger issue to involve. So we'll talk both about Wall Street and Washington today. I want to introduce you to my panel, whom I'm very excited to have with me. CCSR, the Committee on Corporate Social Responsibility, is represented by Bishop Doug Fisher of the Diocese of Western Massachusetts, and he's been chair of this committee for the past several years. Bishop Fisher is a passionate advocate on a range of social issues and has worked tirelessly with the CCSR to effectively implement a faith-based approach to investing. He is particularly passionate and active when it comes to gun safety and has engaged with many companies on that issue across the portfolio of the Episcopal Church. And then let me turn to Rebecca Linder Blatchley. Rebecca is the director of the Office of Government Relations. She actually was one of the leading panelists on a panel we had at the National Cathedral just pre-COVID, and we enjoyed her comments greatly. She has an impressive career in policy, having held various roles at the State Department, the U.S. Africa Command, the U.S. Department of Defense, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So you ask, what can Rebecca not do with that resume? And then let me turn to our own Christopher Rowe. Christopher is one of our managing directors of our investment team, and he helps lead our efforts on socially responsible investing and shareholder engagement. Prior to joining the Church Pension Fund, Christopher spent more than 25 years in the asset management industry, working to align values and investing. So these three panelists actually work very closely together and participate in the regular meetings of the Committee on Corporate Social Responsibility. And their biographies, which the short ones were already impressive, but their longer biographies are being posted in the link for you to peruse. So I'm going to be positing some questions to the panel, but we want this to be very interactive. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to answer them as we go through the program today. And I'm going to start, though, asking Christopher from CPG to give us a bit of foundational information on just talk about what do we mean when we talk about shareholder engagement. That's going to be a pivotal topic as we go through the hour conversation today. So can you give us some background for those who are less familiar with it?
Absolutely, and glad to be with all of you today. So shareholder engagement is the process of working with public companies in our portfolio on issues of corporate social responsibility. So this engagement can take many different forms. It can be Zoom calls, it can be letters, it can be in-person meetings with company management. And then also, as part of the governance process for any publicly traded company, shareholders have the option and right to raise an issue on the ballot for a vote by shareholders at the annual meeting. And so typically, companies don't want these issues to be put on a ballot and be voted on by the entire shareholder body. And so if that is more of a stick approach to bring a company to the table for dialogue, but if an issue is big enough or broad enough, a shareholder resolution may be warranted, or if a company is non-responsive, a shareholder resolution is warranted. But in net, the process of shareholder engagement is working with companies on issues of extreme importance to all of us that align with our fiduciary responsibilities, but also align with our values.
Thank you. So that's shareholder engagement. But as I said earlier, some issues call for shareholder engagement where we want to influence the activities and behavior of a particular company or group of companies. And then other times there's a need for a policy response, and then Rebecca steps in. So Rebecca, can you talk to us a little bit about how one differentiates those issues that require shareholder engagement and those that require a broader policy action?
Yes, thanks so much, Mary Kate, and thanks to CPG for hosting this event. It's great to be with all of you, and I'm always happy to have a chance to talk about the work of the Office of Government Relations and how we partner together in achieving the aims of the church and living into our values. So thank you for that. Just to say a quick word as well, as Mary Kate indicated, the Office of Government Relations represents the policy priorities of the church to the government in Washington. So we're focused on engaging Congress, we're engaging the administration, and through those conversations, and above all, through empowering Episcopalians to take action and themselves reach out to their members of Congress, we hope to be able to make the kind of change that we hope for, to have more just laws and policies that align with the church's values. And in terms of how we know which issue takes which tack, it's often one that's an all of the above approach, that there are corporate efforts focused on having companies change their policies or make sure that they have protections in place to address something like human rights concerns. At the same time, in Washington, we are pushing for Congress to enact legislation that enables the U.S. government to sanction human rights abusing regimes, or to push the State Department to prioritize human rights as a critical element of our foreign policy. So it's often that these issues are really take every possible avenue. They're so massive and take so much effort that we all want to use everything that we can. But there are certain issues that the federal government is uniquely equipped to address. And so we also really do highlight those. So if we're looking at something like immigration reform, that's a federal government issue that we know that states and local entities and corporate engagement, it's harder for those actors to make a difference on it. And so we often partner with the private sector associations, as well as faith-based and secular advocates, to push for the kinds of changes that would then enable many sectors of the U.S. economy to be able to flourish more, because of a better U.S. government immigration policies. And there's other examples, again, around questions of foreign policy, of environmental regulation. But most generally, I think we're most effective when we're able to align across all the avenues of our advocacy.
Thank you. Thank you. And you mentioned immigration and human rights. Do you want to just mention some of the other issues that have kept you busy over the last number of years? What are the range of issues that you've been engaged with on Capitol Hill?
Certainly. So we have 5 areas that are all pretty broad, but that we focus the majority of our efforts on. And so those are anti-poverty, domestic and global. We look at immigration, migration, and refugees, looking at refugee resettlement, of which Episcopal Migration Ministries is one of the 9 federally funded refugee resettlement agencies. We focus on creation care and climate change. We also look at issues of racial justice and reconciliation, and then human rights and peace building, again, in close partnership, not just with non-U.S. Episcopal dioceses, but also partners in the Anglican Communion.
So that's a lot. And I know there are a lot of issues potentially on the plate of companies and the portfolios that we manage. The Episcopal Church has a portfolio of assets, including corporate stocks, as does the church pension fund. So I'd like to hear from the 3 of you. How do you prioritize? I mean, there's only so much time in a day. And how do you decide which issues are going to come to the forefront year after year?
Well, for us, a lot of this is from General Convention. The General Convention lays out priorities, and my committee is charged to implement that. So a lot of it comes from General Convention. But another part of it too is where we think we can have the biggest impact, and that varies from time to time as to what gains momentum, not just from response in the Episcopal Church, but responses from all of our interfaith allies and what they're engaged in. And so that's part of it as well. That we don't drop the things that don't have momentum, but certainly the things that have momentum. For myself, my committee can get really behind and engaged with.
You just mentioned interfaith allies. Rebecca talked about the broader Anglican communion, but you're suggesting that we go beyond even that. What do you want to talk about? Some of the collaboration we might do with other faith-based groups?
Sure. Well, that actually happens on a day-to-day basis because as part of CCSR, we are in the ICCR, which is the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, and that's how we work with Mercy Investments, with Pat Zarega. And so I get updates from them like every 3 or 4 days as to all the different things that they're working on our behalf. So and that actually was formed, as you might know, from the Episcopal Church. It was our engagement 52 years ago with Bishop Hines and General Motors in South Africa that really got us engaged in shareholder actions. And we have a video that's been put out about that December to celebrate the 50th anniversary. And so that's readily available at a couple of links, one of which is at Rebecca's website, also with Kurt Barnes and financial and budget. And so, yeah, we're working with people all the time on those issues. And sometimes, the Methodists take the lead, sometimes the Lutherans take the lead. The gun issues that I work on a lot, Roman Catholic nuns and their religious orders are really engaged in that, I look for them for inspiration all the time.
Bishop Doug, there are questions actually in the chat already on the issue of guns and the effectiveness of gun engagement on the issue of guns. And so wonder if you could comment a little bit on that in response to the question in the chat box around what has been your experience in terms of engaging with gun manufacturers? What kind of responses have there been? And I'd really welcome sort of, and then the follow-on question actually relates to whitewashing. Are gun manufacturers initially responsive and then really brush it off?
Yeah, great questions. Yeah, well, I'm part of Bishops United Against Gun Violence, which was formed in 2012, right after the Sandy Hook tragedy. So there's 100 bishops in the Bishops United Against Gun Violence. So we look for activity on lots of different levels. So the question before, Mary Kate, about should it be a company engagement or a legislative engagement? It's very much both. And in terms of the history of this, the reason that we've been more engaged with gun companies is because of the frustration of not getting anything done at the legislative level, at least on the federal government. Massachusetts, where I'm from, actually has got some of the best gun safety laws in the country. But now, and I will talk to the question about our engagement with gun companies. But now there seems to be some hope in Washington. The most recent actions by President Biden, and we'll see where that goes. Because a lot of our engagement with gun companies centers around AR-15s, and Joe Biden himself in 1994 had that 10-year moratorium on AR-15s that ended in 2004, and gun violence has gone up dramatically since then. So I'm sure that Rebecca can speak to this issue as well. But for us, it really started in 2018 when guns would have been on our no-buy list. But Bishops United Against Gun Violence asked me to sponsor a bill that said that we would invest in gun companies for the sake of dialogue, moving forward with different resolutions, and that's hit a number of bumps. And at the same time, we had a tremendous victory just about 2 months ago. Storm Ruger, who's a big gun manufacturer, and the resolution that we put forward there was for them to mandate an outside auditor that would trace their guns and what we call human rights abuses that would have happened. So in other words, people dying because of their guns. And the board of directors said, vote against this. And shareholders voted by 65% to push forward this resolution, 65%. So that shows some movement for sure. On other levels, through the years, there's been with different retailers of guns. So Dick's Sporting Goods is the famous example. There was certainly pressure from people about that, but ultimately it was a real conversion on the part of the owner of the exporting goods that said, we're not going to sell guns anymore. And then Walmart, there was a big struggle there in terms of resolution to outlaw, to no longer sell assault weapons. And ultimately that passed as well. They do sell guns, but they no longer sell assault weapons. Yeah, so that's some of the things that have gone on with that. You know, another resolution that they just passed General Convention this past year, it's another one I sponsored, was about ghost guns. And so the Episcopal Church has taken a real stand against ghost guns, which are guns that can't be traced. Again, on the federal level, President Biden is pushing to make them illegal. But for the longest time, they have been legal. And what a ghost gun is a gun that comes to you in parts. So the gun is not actually a complete gun, but you have all the parts, and it gives you instructions as to how to put the gun together. And now you have a gun where you didn't go through a background check. They've got no identifying numbers on them, so they can't be traced. So General Convention came out strongly for that resolution and against ghost guns. And one of the ways, in terms of stockholder engagement, is we're not invested in ghost gun companies, and we never will be. But we have resolutions before the major credit card companies to say that they will not accept business from ghost gun companies. And so far that's not passed, but it's certainly been proposed and it's in dialogue.
Thank you. So Rebecca, back to the question of prioritization. You named 5 areas which are very large that you focus on. So obviously you have to make some choices. So talk to us about how you prioritize your work.
We do, thank you. And those 5 are indeed, you know, a prioritization. From this General Convention, we had 45 resolutions directing us to carry out work. And 2018 General Convention gave us 68 resolutions telling us to carry out work as well. And then, of course, all of the previous resolutions from prior General Convention and executive councils, those are still operative and active unless a new resolution has shifted or updated those in some way. So it's really a massive amount of issue areas that we are called to cover. There's a few different ways that we look to prioritize it. You know, one is to make sure that we have something for people to do on all of the General Convention resolutions. So on our webpage, we have action alerts. And so those enable Episcopalians or anyone to reach out to their members of Congress, urging them to take action on a particular piece of legislation. And so those remain up and active until the legislation is passed or until a new congressional session begins. So with that, we know that people who are particularly passionate about issues like gun violence prevention, you know, or criminal justice reform, immigration questions, they can keep using that as a resource. And it doesn't have to be our small staff, but really we're aiming to empower Episcopalians to carry out the mission of the church as well. And we have a facilitating role and try to bring in the expertise that we have from being in regular contact with congressional offices and administration officials and career government employees. But we also look to what is moving and what is happening. Right now is actually a really interesting and exciting time in Congress with the lame duck session. There are a number of pieces of legislation we think could pass. So we're really prioritizing those. Again, we have dozens of resolutions we wanted to pass this congressional session. A good number of them did. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was really significant and meaningful gun violence prevention, gun reform. So we really celebrated that. Some really meaningful environmental legislation was passed, specifically in the Inflation Reduction Act. But right now we're pushing for protections for Dreamers, protections for Afghans who came here after the US withdrawal, who don't yet have a way to permanent status in the US. We're pushing for online protections for children, which is a new resolution that convention directed us to take action on just this past summer, for wildlife protection. And we were pushing for the Respect for Marriage Act, which just passed. And these are all bipartisan pieces of legislation as well. That's another priority for our office. A General Convention resolution from 2018 directed us to work in a bipartisan manner whenever possible. And of course, we're a nonpartisan institution, and we're carrying out the work of the church, which of course cannot support political parties or candidates. So at this moment, we are really focused on what we think can make it through in the next few weeks. So I would urge all of you to look at our website and see what you can do to take action. I'm hopeful that a lot of good things can happen in the weeks ahead.
So much for a reflective Advent for you, Rebecca.
And if I could just add to that too, sometimes at General Convention, we have these, we have so many resolutions, and a lot of them have to do with social justice. But sometimes people say, oh, those are just pious words. At the House of Bishops and House of Deputies, you just get to feel good about yourself because you came up with this statement. And the fact is that the work that Rebecca does, the work that you all do at CPG, that really shows that General Convention means something. Those are not just pious thoughts and prayers. Those things really get enacted throughout the times in between General Convention by all of you. So it shows the importance of convention, and shows that we act on what we believe.
Thank you. Yes. And so, Christopher, that's a good segue. You want to say a little bit about how we think at CPG about prioritizing some of the issues?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So, I mean, as Bishop Fisher mentioned, we do take direction from General Convention, and certainly there are resolutions that have come out of General Convention that we can go into more detail on that we have been responsive to. We certainly also, this week is our board week, and so we do take direction from our very valued board of directors who have perspective on where we should be taking issues. And then, of course, we take direction from the presiding bishop and some of his messages. And so, so from there, we have themes such as care for creation and racial justice and human rights. All of these things are important that then turn around and are reflected in the work that we do across the 4 pillars that Mary Kate outlined. And so we do look for opportunities to engage with companies on their impact around climate. We do look for opportunities to engage with companies around how they're thinking about their supply chain and how they're thinking about labor relations issues. And we certainly do work with companies on governance issues around board diversity. And one interesting resolution that actually came out of convention was a resolution on sustainability expertise on board of directors. A resolution back in 2018 asked us specifically to engage with companies to make sure that there are more individuals who have sustainability expertise on their boards as a way of putting a climate lens into governance. And so we, as requested, engaged with 10 different companies on the issue. And the dialogues were very rich, but it was also very responsive. And the dialogues focused not only on individuals that have a scientific expertise, which is important, but individuals that have an expertise and ability to influence. Because if you have a scientist who sits in the corner and spouts scientific theories, but isn't able to get those scientific theories into action in a governance context, it doesn't do much good. And so that would be one example of where General Convention put forth a resolution, and then we in turn responded with action.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask each of you to talk about some of the successes that you've had in advocacy. And Bishop Fisher, you mentioned the 50th anniversary of CCSR. So kind of looking over the past decades, do you want to talk about some of the great accomplishments of CCSR? Sure.
There's a number of them. And to also know, especially when you look at 50 years, that this work is slow work. It's when we put forward a resolution at a company, the first time around, it might get, 10, 15%. But then, you put it forward year after year, and as it grows, before it even gets to 50%, a lot of times the board of directors will respond because they see where this is going. So it takes a period of time for sure. One of the great successes is with in terms of human rights, is with dealing with hotel chains so that they can spot people who are being trafficked. And so and actually now all the major hotel chains have adopted this. So that started with a resolution to mandate hotel chains educate their employees so that they could spot human trafficking. And so, and that kind of work is spread out too, to now looking at the trucking industry, and how the trucking industry can teach workers how to spot human trafficking. Another place too, is we deal certainly a lot with climate. We have, in terms of General Convention, divested from fossil fuel companies, but we also engage companies in a lot of ways in terms of their own carbon footprint. And so, Delta Airlines, for instance, they passed a major resolution to get to net zero. We're dealing with UPS in the same way about how they can reduce their carbon footprint. So those are some of the ways, and other ways too have been with board diversity. Looking at boards who mostly are white men, and to make the board diverse, to more express what their shareholders are and the people that they market to. And in addition to that, there's just been things that we have signed on to with ICCR, which we wouldn't, which their work is just so invaluable to us. And so they do a lot of work with things like equal pay for men and women for the same job. And that's been a success story throughout this time too.
And you referred earlier to getting a 60% vote on a shareholder resolution. I think there were the days until recently when shareholder votes, unless they had management approval, were doomed for failure. I mean, with very small single-digit or low double-digit votes in favor. But that seems to be changing and evolving. Do you want to just speak to what you're seeing there in terms of the actual success in putting forth resolutions?
Yeah, well, I think some of that is, and we can talk more about this in terms of ESG type investing, but companies realize that people are doing this to actually make the company more sustainable over the long haul. And so I think that's some of the response. They're realizing this is actually good for business. An example that I can bring out about in terms of guns, which has not been successful, but we hope someday, is there's this technology, the smart gun technology, and what that is, it's a really simple concept. It's that only the fingerprint of the person who owns the gun can pull the trigger. It's the same concept that goes into your iPhone, right? The only person in the world that can open my iPhone is me with my fingerprint, right? And this technology is available throughout Europe. Well, that would make gun companies better companies. Car companies do that all the time, right? They're not required to have a camera that allows me to go backwards in reverse in a parking lot and see people. They do that because it's a better product. It's a better product. So we hope that people respond to that.
Thank you. Rebecca, do you want to talk about some of the successes you've seen recently?
Absolutely. I think there's been a number of successes. And again, I'm still hopeful that there'll be a few more before the year is out. But during the pandemic, I think that we were able to, along with many of our partners, push for protections for the most vulnerable. So there was an expanded child tax credit that was refundable, meaning that even families that didn't pay enough in taxes to benefit or get the refund would be eligible for the full tax benefit. And we saw child poverty cut in half. The expanded child tax credit has expired, but we are hopeful that there will be legislation before the end of the year that will include making the child tax credit fully refundable going forward. So, a core church value, something that we have explicit policy on from General Convention, and something that was a success, at least for a period of time. I mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act with the environmental provisions and a number of racial justice provisions addressing environmental racism as a piece of that. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was the gun reform piece. There was also the bipartisan infrastructure law, which has, again, a number of provisions looking at a bunch of issues, some of which we're interested in, some of which we're not, but that would address providing support to low-income communities, making sure that there's an investment in communities that have historically been marginalized or pushed aside. So that is something. The Violence Against Women Act, the church has spoken on issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls for some time, and the Violence Against Women Act has provisions that help those perpetrators be brought to justice. There was anti-hate crimes legislation that passed in this Congress as well. And then there's also, and Bishop Doug mentioned this, the administration's action. So whether that's through rulemaking and regulatory changes that we're also active in, submitting comments, having conversations with US government departments and agencies, or through the Biden administration executive orders on things like ghost guns and other, gun reform steps. So we have been glad to see a number of those changes that have been in line with what we're looking at. I'll also just note that sometimes the work and the successes are public, and we're able to celebrate them. And sometimes a lot of what we're doing is behind the scenes and is longer term, so may not have a yield this Congress, but ideally is building momentum for the kind of change we hope to see going forward. So sometimes we're also just trying to get more bipartisan co-sponsors on a bill, even if we know it won't get a vote on the floor this session. So we also count those as successes, because we know that it takes sometimes years, sometimes decades, for legislation to move forward and to get the critical mass needed for it to pass, and then again to be able to have an impact and help Americans and others around the world.
Thank you. Great examples. Christopher, do you want to talk about perhaps a couple of engagements that you've had and where we've seen success?
Well, Bishop Fisher had mentioned the issues around human trafficking and sex trafficking, and that is one area that we have had some success on. We've worked with, he mentioned hotel companies and trucking companies. We've also had engagements with airlines on the topic. And so the issue is not that airlines are proponents or actively participate in trafficking, but they are in a position to stop it. And so we've had very successful conversations with airlines on the topic of how do you train your employees? How do you work with your employees to identify cases where an individual may or may not be trafficked? And so there are rules in place and there are processes in place for identifying individuals who are trafficked. And so one recent engagement we've had with one of the major airlines, they did have a case where a young woman was in a case of being trafficked, and because of the training that took place, her trafficking was prevented, and she was stopped and she was freed from those that were trafficking her. So a lot of people ask, does this work make a difference? And I think about that one case because it's not a case that is global, but it's a case that's personal and a case that's meaningful. And so I would highlight that as one example of the success of this good work.
Thank you. So all of us, CCSR, Office of Government Relations, CPG, all of us share the same church values, but given our different roles, they might get expressed in different ways. We might act on them in different ways. I'll leave it open to the three of you. Can you just comment on that and where we can align and where we might go different directions on issues?
I'm happy to jump in on that question, Mary Kay. Thanks for asking that. I think it's such an important point that we all have different institutional roles. And then for us, we're on the staff of DFMS, the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society, and our office's role is distinct from many of our colleagues that we work alongside in the presiding bishop's staff even. But our role in government relations, which is really just one small piece of the church's public witness, of the church's efforts to make change in communities and push for a more just world. I think of what we're doing as the sort of final push to get something into the goal. When legislation's been introduced and we just need some voices of constituents or high-level grass tops leaders to push members of Congress to do the right thing and take a vote. We want to make sure that gets crossed, but we're relying on the work of parishes that are doing community outreach and organizers. I saw a question about that. There's lots of different ways where people are helping the conversation be shifted and helping there be momentum so that the stage where we come in when legislation has been introduced or will be introduced so that we can move forward. I'm close to having a soccer analogy. I know it's World Cup season, but I'm not the expert to be able to say, but we're maybe the striker getting it across, and we're grateful for the defense in the midfield. But yes, in part, we're just one small piece of it. So we always try to say that we hope people feel called to their area of ministry and their gifts and their strength. And if people are really called to community and grassroots engagement, we love and celebrate that. That may not be where our office is. Sometimes we're not the most vocal because we're trying to have private conversations. And sometimes kind of public shaming is helpful and effective. And sometimes building trust behind the scenes is something we found to be more effective. So we're not always publicly speaking out, but we're always engaged.
Example, yes.
So I would like to jump in and just talk about the nuance of this work. I mean, because certainly there are black and white issues, but a lot of the issues can be gray. And even if with something that is sort of accepted collectively. So as Mary Kate mentioned, in an earlier life prior to coming to CPG, I worked with clients on aligning their values with their investment portfolio. And I had two different clients who had a shared concern for world peace. And it was a shared value that they each cared about deeply. And yet one client wanted military weapons in their portfolio, and because they believed a strong military is the key to world peace. And others did not want military weapons, believing that military weapons are contrary to world peace. And so they shared the same value, but often in the nuance, how do you execute on that value? Well, how do you implement that value can be really complicated. And that similar dynamic has bubbled up in our recent conversations around Ukraine, and that horrific and unjust and horrible war that needs to stop. We all agree it needs to stop, but the Ukrainians need weapons. Now, should we be financing those weapons? That is a reasonable debate, a debate that we should be having, but there's no question that they need weapons to defend themselves. On the other hand, we've had some interesting dialogues with companies on this issue where some technology companies have had their technology showing up in Russian missiles and Iranian drones that were used against Ukraine. And so we've been actively engaging with those companies on doing a better job of monitoring to whom are they selling their products? How are they working through their customer chain, knowing their customer to make sure that the end customer isn't using it for reasons that we would not be at all approving.
Yeah, that's a great example, Christopher. And I think it's in terms of not just that issue, but a lot of issues. I've been impressed in these years with the really rich dialogue about should we invest or divest, and again, opinions are many different directions, even on my own committee, right? So, but those are really, really important discussions to have. So sometimes divestment might be the best way, but sometimes it's investment, and then can you put a time limit on the investment, so that you're investing, you're hoping to make change, and if the company's been unresponsive for 15 years, do you then divest? So I've always been intrigued by that conversation.
Thank you. Well, let me go to you, Bishop Fisher. And I've heard you talk about making a distinction between being a prophet with a prophet PH and prophetic leadership. Can you tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, even in terms of my vows as a bishop, one of the questions that you get asked on your ordination day is, will you stir up the conscience of the people? So there's a prophetic part of our ministry, prophetic part of being our church. And historically, there have been people who have been prophets who really do point us to the ideals of the kingdom of God. They do. And they live that out. And sometimes they die for those convictions. And so thank God for the prophets. And at the same time, prophetic leadership is helping to move the community towards that idea, which means that sometimes you've got to, well, Rebecca would know about this, politics is the art of the possible, right? So how can you move the community in a prophetic way towards what the prophets are saying. And prophets are usually think we're not going fast enough. And so in our church, we say, thank God for the prophets. Thank God. We want their voice. We want those voices in the room. And we're going to do all that we can, as we can, to fulfill that prophecy. Martin Luther King Jr., certainly a great prophet. He's got this line, I'll read it directly. He says, if Christians don't change the world with our faith, then Jesus of Nazareth was just the utopian dreamer. So he puts out the prophecy, and then how can we lead people in that direction? An example of that in my own ministry is, we've had these witnesses at Smith and Wesson through the years. But what we do is we empower young people to lead it, so that it's young people who are, going to be impacted by this and climate change and all kinds of things in a much greater way as things move along. And so we're there behind them. We're there to support them. So there's a need for both. There's need for the prophet who's like John the Baptist shouting in the wilderness, and there's need for prophetic leadership to move towards the kingdom of God.
Well, I love the reference to your vows and stirring up the conscience. That's really what we're doing with this work, isn't it? Whether it's Congress or whether it's corporate management or otherwise, that's what we're about here. So I want to go back to you, Rebecca, and just talk about the atmosphere in Congress. I mean, we all hear about how polarized Congress is, how polarized the country is, and yet you've referred to some bipartisan legislation. Do you have any hope that we will kind of be able to find that middle where people can actually collaborate? Maybe in those private conversations you're having?
Exactly. I do have hope. I mean, the broad opinion of Congress is that it's so deeply dysfunctional and caught in gridlock. And certainly there are many aspects when you can see that we don't pass appropriations bills as we should on time. So there's continuing resolutions or, there's a lot that's dysfunctional, but there's also a lot that has happened. And actually satisfaction, and polling shows that satisfaction with individual members of Congress is often much higher than with Congress as an entity. I do remind people that there's some dysfunction and gridlock built into the system. Members of Congress are representing very different constituents that have very different priorities and values. So it can be hard to come to agreement, especially on political hot button issues, unfortunately. Often where we're able to see progress is on issues that haven't yet broken into partisan camps. I think that cryptocurrency regulation, for instance, is an area that where we may see progress. General Convention this summer called on us to be concerned with the environmental impact of cryptocurrency and to look into regulation. That's a new area for us. And so maybe that would be something that could move. Convention also directed us to look into legislation that would help reform the foster care system. Of course, much of that is at the state and local level, but there's also federal funding and oversight. So that could be an issue. Sometimes on family policies, there can be points of alignment and agreement. So I'm, hopeful, but just, also to build on what Bishop Doug said, we are all as a church called to be agitating for transformative change. At the same time, I know that we also want to take incremental change when that's what's available to us. We wouldn't want to say no to something, even if it didn't go far enough. The gun reform bill didn't go as far as we wanted, but we know that the people negotiating that in Congress got the best deal they could, and that we wanted to be able to take that as a first step. On criminal justice, there's been some reforms that have been in the right direction, not far enough, but we want to take those and make sure that we're helping people now, and it doesn't eliminate the need for us to continue pushing for, again, the kind of transformative change that we want, but we also don't want to refuse it because it doesn't go far enough, because that isn't going to help any of us, I think, in the near term. And I think that those can be pretty unhelpful dynamics when we're not willing to compromise or take what's possible in this moment. And then let's change the political conditions on the ground so more is possible. But just refusing, the one chance we have on certain issues to be able to make progress, I think is something we're often helping to try to educate Episcopalians about, and again, educate members of Congress about, to say that we really are committed to the change that can help people now in their lives, even as we also take the longer view.
Mary Kate, if I could just take this opportunity to plug a book from one of my fellow bishops, because it's on this topic of overcoming division. And it's Mark Beckwith. He used to be the Bishop of Newark. He's now in New England, and I work with him. And his book is called Seeing the Unseen Beyond Prejudices, Paradigms, and Party Lines. And it's really a lot of practical advice about how this, as you mentioned, this very divided time in our country, how we can talk to people who we don't necessarily agree with, but be able to do that. Seeing the Unseen by Mark Beckwith.
Excellent. Maybe we can get that into the chat as well for people to see, or into the Q&A.
If I might follow up on Rebecca's comments as well, because her comments relate to the earlier question on sort of what falls in Washington and what falls in our work in corporate engagement. And there are times when things are happening in Washington and policies are being passed that advance some of our shared values, and times when Washington is moving in a different direction and corporate engagement is more effective. And one example would be under the previous administration, the administration pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord. And when that happened, companies responded and shareholders responded saying, well, while the US is out, we're still in. So we were in a number of engagements with companies saying, well, we're still in. So while there was a policy movement in one direction, there was a corporate movement in another direction. And vice versa can be true. If companies aren't operating in the right direction, then maybe policy, when it's functional and when things are happening, can address when corporations aren't working. But I think there's a direct relationship one to the next to move our shared values forward. So
are there questions, Christopher? I want to make sure that we get, if there are questions that have been unanswered. I know that we have answered many of them.
There's one question in the chat that asks whether or not there's a socially responsible fund available to participants in the various the RSVP and lay defined contribution plans.
Oh, go ahead.
And the answer is yes. There's one that is labeled as such. It's the DFA Sustainable Core Equity Fund. On top of that, it would be important to note. So Mary Kate mentioned that we have one of our pillars is ESG incorporation. So how are the managers that we are hiring incorporating issues of importance around environmental issues, social issues, governance issues? And so we did an audit of all of the fund offerings within both of those plans, and every single manager incorporates E, S, and G into the context of their investment analysis. So 100% of the defined contribution plan is fully incorporating ESG issues, and one particular fund is very much focused on sustainability.
Great, thank you. And we'd actually, I mean, there isn't a huge uptake in the SRI fund that we actually have in the lineup. So people might want to kind of take another look and think about their allocation of their defined contribution assets. Wonderful. Well, we have, if there are no more questions, we have a few more minutes, and this might have been kind of more foundational, but I'd like to spend a little time just Rebecca and Bishop Fisher talking in a little more detail about the two of your organizations. Rebecca, you mentioned a small staff. I think it would be interesting for people to understand how you're organized. And Bishop Fisher, just talk about how you pull together the work of the CCSR, who's on the committee, how you organize meetings, just give people a sense of the kind of nuts and bolts of how you both get your work done.
So yes, we are a small staff based in Washington. So the office was set up in 1979. So we have been an advocacy office based in Washington since that time. And I think when the office first started, there was maybe a director and a staff person. And then there was a time there were 10 to 12 people on staff. And now we have 4 full-time staff and 1 part-time person that is shared with the ELCA, or a part-time person and then a shared position and then 3 full-time staff. So we have a big mandate, but again, I think with advocacy, we have plenty to do at any time. And even if we had a staff 5 times the size, there would always be more that we wanted to do because the issues are so important. And it's of course possible to get into so much great detail. Luckily, because we work with coalition partners. So again, those are other ecumenical partners and organizations, nonprofits, secular groups, interfaith partners. We often rely on those expertise, the organizations that have 4 full-time staff just looking at criminal justice reform, or there's a person we work with whose full-time job is to specialize in trying to reform prison phone call rates. Actually, a really important issue. Phone call rates are prohibitively expensive. They mean that people who are incarcerated aren't able to talk to their loved ones, be in touch with their kids, that kind of thing. So we don't know as much about it, and we're glad to be able to learn from this colleague and then participate in meetings and sign on to letters, et cetera. So yeah, again, small team with a big mission, and then we're always welcoming ideas for how we can better serve the church, better serve Episcopalians.
Small but powerful, small but mighty. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and for us, we're a committee that's appointed by the presiding bishop. So Michael Curry at each general convention appoints new people, and in addition, additional people. We're really blessed with some people who have been around for a lot of those 50 years. They've really been working at this since they were in their 20s, and their institutional memory is great, and their commitment and their passion. And then too, just in terms of how the Holy Spirit works, different people without being assigned will feel passionate about one or more general conventions and general convention resolutions, and they'll be working really hard on that and report to that. Just in terms of the practicalities of getting it done, we're in Mercy Investments, and Pat Zariga is our representative, and she's tremendous. I mean, she does what we ask her to do, and then she also comes up with all the kinds of things to say, this aligns with your values, and a whole lot of different things that I wouldn't even have known were out there unless she brings it up. And so then we move on that. And then I really want to be grateful to Kurt Barnes's office, the treasurer of the Episcopal Church, because he is engaged in this in a whole lot of different ways. And so we put forward the resolutions. He does the sign-on letters. So I'm really grateful for his work within all this. And Rebecca and Christopher are there all the time too, and we really draw on their expertise.
I know we're delighted, and Clayton Crowley, who's also have perennial invitations to come to your committee meetings, and we really value that collaboration. That's terrific to be part of what you do.
One thing I could say too though is, and this applies to OGR as well, is that when I do visitations to parishes, and after the liturgy there'll be a forum, and I'll bring up things that are going on in the church wider than their parish, right? And I'll always bring up socially responsible investing, and people have no idea that the Episcopal Church is engaged in that. So I'm really grateful to you for webinars like this. But I think it's something to get. Well, maybe the video will help get the word out on it. But that this is a really important ministry for our church that has a big impact.
It does, and we all love to talk about what we do in this space. So. But that being said, our time has come to a close. So I'm so grateful to our panelists for joining us. What a great conversation. And thank you to everybody who took time out during a contemplative but very busy period to join us for an hour. We're grateful to have you with us and look forward to further engaging on these topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to be with all of you.